All right, now that we've taken a look at a few examples of subjective ethics, we've looked at subjective ethical relativism and conventional ethical relativism, we're going to move over onto the other side of our roadmap, and we're going to start looking at some of those theories that believe that there are such thing as at least one universal moral principle. So we're going to look at some of those today. We're going to look at actually one specific theory, but before we do that, I want to introduce the first category that we'll look at. We're going to take a look at consequentialist ethics as a category in and of itself. Now, we'll look at two forms of consequentialist ethics, both in this video and the next. In this video, we're going to look at egoism, and then in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at utilitarianism. But both of those theories, while they may be very different, have some things in common. For example, they both are versions of what are known as consequentialist ethics. Now, consequentialist ethics are those ethical systems that believe that you ought to look at the consequence of the act, or the consequence that the act produces, to determine whether or not the act itself is moral. So these are ethical systems that judge the moral worth of an act based on the consequences or the effect that that act generates. So the first one we'll look at is egoism. The second is utilitarianism. Now, both of these theories also are versions of hedonism. They're hedonistic in nature. Now, what hedonism is, and a number of your consequentialist ethical theories are going to be hedonistic in nature. Hedonism is the notion that the greatest good can be defined by maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain. Maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain. Hedonism believes that the greatest good is pleasure and the greatest evil would be pain. So our ethical pursuits ought to be wrapped up in providing the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. Now that can seem kind of simplistic. That can seem kind of almost immoral, if you will. In fact, sometimes if somebody were to call you a hedonist, that wouldn't be such a flattering statement a lot of times, because the connotation that we have of what a hedonist is just somebody who goes out and indulges in physical pleasures and things with no forethought to anything higher than that or better than that. Well, technically speaking, a hedonist is not such a person. A hedonist is not an overindulgent person. The Epicureans back in ancient Greece were hedonists, and Epicurus himself taught that we should avoid extremes, either too much pleasure, too much pain. We should avoid extremes, because extremes are what generate the most amount of pain. Because if a person just overindulges in everything, and one would think that they're actually having a pleasurable life if they're going out and they're eating as much as they can, they're just kind of laying around having a good old time all the time. Well, that sort of pursuit, or that life, the pursuit of that kind of life, is going to result in a lot of pain. You're going to develop health issues. You're probably going to not have any money to survive on, and so forth. So hedonism is not just overindulging your pleasures and constantly seeking to indulge your pleasures. Hedonism is described by a more moderate pursuit of pleasure and a minimization of pain. And so that's the hedonistic version of what the greatest good is. Now, keep in mind also that the many hedonists of the past have believed that this sort of important caveat. They would say that we need to pursue pleasure, but we need to pursue it in a manner that is consistent with human nature. Now, Aristotle made that particular claim, and we'll see more about that in virtue ethics, and he was not a hedonist, but the hedonists agree with this. They believe that if we are seeking pleasure in a manner that is inconsistent with our nature as human beings, then we'll never either we'll never be fulfilled completely, or we actually might generate some pain for ourselves. Now, what does that mean, to seek pleasure in a manner consistent with our human nature? Well, human beings, in addition to having a physical body that either renders a good amount of pleasure or pain, human beings also have a mind that is capable of greater things than any other animal on planet Earth. And so that is part of what it means to be human. That's part of our nature. And so what we ought to do in our pursuit of pleasure, we cannot neglect, says the hedonist, we cannot neglect that aspect of us that is rational. And we must engage in rational pursuits, in intellectual pursuits. Because if we don't do that, then we're seeking pleasure as something else, something other than a human being. So maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, this is sort of the hedonist ideal. They're both in both forms of consequentialist ethics that we'll look at involve this notion. But the question then becomes, whose pleasure ought to be maximized and whose pain ought to be minimized? Because it's not immediately apparent whose pleasure and whose pain we're talking about. Now, normally we'll just kind of default to, well, it should be my pleasure or my pain. And one of the views that we'll look at actually does believe that, but is that always the case? Whose pleasure should be maximized? And if we're talking society-wide, whose pleasure should be maximized and whose pain should be minimized? That's the first question, and the answer to that question is going to lead to the division in the theories that we'll look at today. Both theories are consequentialist in nature. Both theories are hedonistic in nature. Both theories say that pleasure ought to be sought as the good, but whose pleasure are we talking about? Now, egoism, the one that we'll look at in this video, says that one should always do what is in his or her own best interest. In other words, a person ought to be concerned more with maximizing their own pleasure and minimizing their own pain. Whereas utilitarianism is a view that says one ought to always do what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. That view would say one ought to always work to maximize the pleasure of the majority of society and minimize the pain of the majority of society. Sometimes, though, that, as we'll see, that is at the expense of the minority. But we'll see that when we get to utilitarianism in the next video. All right, so egoism is what we're going to look at first. It's a consequentialist ethic. And it's a hedonistic ethic, and egoism operates off of the principle that says, this one universal moral principle, just one, that says one ought to always do what is in his or her own best interest. You should do what's in your best interest, I should do what's in my best interest. That is the operating principle of egoism, that if everyone sought their own best interest, then overall, that would be the moral thing to do. Even living in society, it would be the moral thing to do if you sought your best interest and I sought mine. Now, this is to be contrasted with altruism. Altruism is the notion that we ought to work for the benefit of other people. We've heard the term altruistic. We've probably heard that in our lives. Basically, that means to look out for others. And if you think about, just in our society, the values that our society purports to hold, how would you answer the following question? Which one in our society is generally looked at as a more moral option? Self-sacrifice for the sake of others, or self-interest for the sake of oneself? In other words, is it more moral to be selfless or selfish? Well, in our society, there may be a lot of selfish people, but we tend to honor those who are selfless. We tend to lift them up on a pedestal. We write stories about them in the local newspapers. You know, we have them on TV shows. We make TV shows about them. We have them on the news or news programs so that we can interview them. The people who make sacrifices for the sake of others, that's the kind of thing that we in our culture believe everyone should aspire to. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody does it or that everybody is even capable of it. It's just in our culture, that's what we prize. That's what we advocate for. That's what we try to move people toward. Egoism, though, believes that altruism is not only bad or unbeneficial, some people could see how that could be the case, right? Because if I'm sacrificing myself for the sake of others, then when do I come in, you know? But egoism, those who are ethical egoists, believe that altruism is not just impractical, but that it's actually immoral, that it's bad to do, that it's that as a system, altruism would lead our society into all kinds of debauchery, would lead society into all kinds of bad things. And that seems counterintuitive to us in a culture and a society that prizes altruism. But we'll see what their rationality is here in just a moment. Before we delve any further into it, I want to clear up a few misconceptions about egoism. Because egoism, as it's presented oftentimes in books, philosophy books and ethical books, sometimes gets misrepresented. It isn't represented as it is by those who hold to those views. For example, ethical egoism is not the same thing as what I'm going to call, for the purposes of this lecture, egotism. Ethical egoism is not the same thing as egotism. Now, I'm making a distinction there, and if you go to a dictionary, you could argue the fact that they both mean the same thing, but I want to make a distinction between two concepts, egoism and egotism, and those are just the names I'm going to give them for the moment. So egoism is the idea that I'm going to do what's in my best interest, and I expect that you do what is in your best interest. I don't expect for you to sacrifice your interest for my sake, and you shouldn't expect me to sacrifice my interest for your sake. So the general expectation of each individual in society is that we're going to be operating based on what our best interest is, what our greatest interest is. When we come into a relationship, I don't expect you to give something to me without expecting something in return. Now, that something in return may not always be material in nature. It could be a different, not all values are the same kind. For example, a person might give to charity, and so they're giving a material value, and what they receive in response is the knowledge and the feeling associated with having helped someone, do better or eat or be clothed or whatever. And so that furnishes them with an emotional value that they have just purchased at the expense of their material value. Even in that situation, the egoist would say that's a value for value exchange. And some might look at that and say, well, that person is being so altruistic. The egoist would look at that and say, no, they received a value for it. They didn't do it for nothing. They didn't just throw their money to the wind. What they did was they gave their money so that they could see people, so they could see a smile on a child's face, so that they could see a person benefited and warmed and growing and healthy. And that furnished them with a certain value that's a spiritual value or an emotional value. It may not be a physical, tangible value. So not all values are of the same kind, but the egoist would say that that's a value for value exchange. That person purchased a good feeling for their money. The egoist, on the other hand, whereas the egoist would say, I come to the table. I don't expect you to sacrifice yourself for me. You shouldn't expect me to sacrifice myself for you. We are going to engage in a value for value exchange, and that is the basis of our relationship. The egotist would say this. This is the difference. The egotist would say, well, I'm going to do what's in my best interest, and I expect everybody else out here at their own expense to do what is in my best interest as well. So the egotist kind of puts themselves at the center of the universe, expecting everybody else to benefit them in some way. Whereas the egoist says, look, I'm not concerned with what I don't expect anybody to give me anything for free. I'm going to do what's in my best interest. I expect you to do the same. And on the basis of a value for value exchange, we can have a relationship, whatever that relationship might be. It might be something of the nature, it might be something, for example, where it's a business relationship, and so we buy and sell to one another, engage in trade in order to benefit each other. I'm selling my stuff and buying from you, and you're selling your stuff and buying from somebody. We're all doing what's in our own best interest, and yet we're building one another up. Our society is being enabled to build up at that same time. But it is not that I expect that everybody would give of their own substance in order to benefit me at their own expense. That they should not expect something in return. So egoism is not the same thing as egotism. The second misconception really is that egoists cannot do anything or will not do anything to benefit other people. And that is, again, a misconception of egoism. It doesn't accurately represent their belief. An egoist very well may do something that benefits others. And here's the key, though. They do it with the expectation of a value for value exchange. And so they engage in trade. So again, not all values are material in nature. Some values might be spiritual, some values might be emotional. And so when they give something out, they expect something in return. That's what an egoist does. But an egoist can do something that's apparently beneficial to somebody else. It's just that when they do it, they are receiving some kind of value for it as well. I mentioned a minute ago somebody who might give to charity, and it looks like they're being a very altruistic person. It looks like they're doing it because they're doing something that benefits others. However, in the process of doing that which benefits others, in the process of in that process, they are benefiting themselves as well. That's what egoism does. It does benefit others. You know, there may be there definitely is an interest, a self-interest for me to benefit other people. It helps me socially, it helps me emotionally, it helps me spiritually. And if I give of my material resources or my time or my energy, and in order to benefit others, that does help me. I think about, for example, maybe Subaru. I mean, there's a Subaru plant in Lafayette, right? So maybe Subaru gives a Purdue University, because they're in Lafayette too. So Subaru gives Purdue University, let's say, a scholarship fund where they put 10 students through school at Purdue for automotive engineering. And with the expectation that, or with the guarantee that if those students do well and they maintain those scholarships and they graduate with their automotive engineering degree, that now they'll go to work for Subaru in order to help them design and build their next vehicle. So it looks like Subaru is being this very altruistic organization because it gives scholarship funds to automotive engineering students, but really they're doing it because that might benefit them in the future, especially if they guarantee them a job and put them to work, and they can use their talents and their skills to build new cars, which will benefit Subaru. So the egoist does believe in benefiting others because benefiting others can benefit them. And they can and they will expect some things in return. Arguments in favor of egoism. Why should egoism? Why would egoism be the right way to go? Well, an egoist would say, for example, that egoism. They would note egoism is the basis of social contract. Social contract is the notion that people in the state of nature come together, they agree to forego harming one another and enter into a contract so as to partake of the benefits and protections of society. They appoint a sovereign over them whose duty it is to enforce the contract, and because of that contract, they can have the benefits of all kinds of things, really, trade and currency and culture and relationships and so forth. All of these things that come along with society. But if you think about it, back to the point where you were in the state of nature, you didn't agree to exit the state of nature for the benefit of everybody else, right? You weren't thinking, oh, well, I better lay down my arms and stop harming others in the state of nature because I don't want to see other people harmed. You laid down your arms in the state of nature at the same time that everybody else did, with the expectations that they would as well, so that you could benefit yourself. Because you wanted the benefits of society, you wanted the protections of society. And in order to do that, you had to lay down your arms. So social contract is founded upon the notion of egoism. Everybody in society looking out for their own best interest, realizing that if I enter into society, that it'll be much safer for me there, much more beneficial for me there. So in the interest of preservation of the self and human flourishing of the self, that's why we got involved with the social contract. And since the social contract forms the basis of most societies, or all societies really, from the family unit all the way to nations and even the UN, then egoism would say, see, that's sort of the default. That's the default mode of human society. It's egoism. And I think it's a pretty good argument. Honestly, it's certainly a fair observation that if we are talking about a state of nature where, I would not put down my weapons and agree to peace unless somebody else was willing to do so as well. Because the moment you put down your weapons, then you make yourself a target, right? Then people can come and take your resources. So you did it out of self-interest. You waited until everybody else was agreeing to do it. Everybody put it down at the same time, and you did it for self-interest. So egoism it forms the basis of social contract. That's one argument for egoism. Now another one would be this. And this one is kind of controversial because probably not a lot of egoists would use it. Maybe you'll see why here when I explain it. And that is this. There are some who argue that egoism actually benefits everyone and leads to the best kind of society. So egoism leads to the best kind of society. That would be another argument. And the argument kind of goes like this. That if everybody's looking out for their own self-interest, that actually serves to propel people to greater heights, right? So if I am allowed to for example, let's take this in the economic realm. If I'm allowed to make all the money that I want to make, then and I'm a very ambitious person, a lot of energy and very creative and this sort of thing, I'm going to take that. I'm going to take whatever resources I have. I'm going to invest them. I'm going to multiply them. I'm going to gain and always keep moving upward and this sort of thing. I get more money. I reinvest it. I work hard so the business is successful, and so on. Now, when I do that, what happens? Well, as I'm doing that, I'm looking out for my own best interest. That's why I'm doing it. I want to get richer. I want to have more wealth. I want to have ease of life in my later years and so forth. And so I engage in this kind of behavior, and along the way, as my business grows, what am I able to do then? Well, I'm able to employ other people, and they come to work for me, but they come to work for me for a wage. They don't do it at their own expense. They are looking to promote to better themselves and be better off in this sort of thing. So they're looking out for their best interest. And they're able to get a job in order to do that because I was looking out for my best interest. And out of the overflow of our energy and productivity, what's going to happen in that realm is that we are all going to produce way more than we consume. And in general, that's going to bring the level of society up, economically speaking. If everybody's allowed to pursue their own self-interest, at a very minimum, people are going to work enough to avoid starvation. But there are people who will work far more than that, who will produce far more than that. And in general, that's going to lift the level of the standard of living in society, and everybody's going to go up. Yes, we're going to have some people who are fantastically wealthy, beyond anything that they could ever spend in this lifetime. But in general, that's going to lift the level of all of society, all the way around. So that even the poorest people in society are going to be wealthier than they would have been had we not engaged in this kind of behavior, this egoistic kind of behavior. As you can see, perhaps, this also forms the basis of the economic theory known as capitalism, that a person ought to be free to produce as much or as little as they desire. In order to do that, if they're able to do that, rather, they're going to be able to lift society. The economic prospects of society are going to ever more be better, and they're going to be greater. Now, the reason I said at the initial that egoists may not use this justification, remember the original argument was egoism actually benefits everyone and leads to the best society. The reason I think that egoists may be kind of reticent to use this kind of reasoning is because they're not really concerned with what benefits the rest of society. They're not, that's not a justification for their ability to go and produce whatever they want to, or to seek their own self-interest. So it would seem kind of contradictory if I was appealing to the notion that hey, it'll benefit everybody, when really the greatest good for me is my own self-interest. So this argument kind of turns self-interest into a means to an end, an instrumental good, whereas the egoist would say that self-interest is actually the greatest good, that it has good in itself. And that's really what we want to turn to next. The idea that egoism is good, or self-interest, pursuing one's self-interest, is good in and of itself. Well, I want to introduce a lady named Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand is a philosopher. She lived during the time of she saw the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. She originally was from Russia, and she lived in a under the czars. Her father owned a business. He was very wealthy. Their family was very wealthy. But as the revolution took place and the communists took over, what ended up happening is that this once wealthy family, whose father worked for a living, who built his own business up from ground zero and so forth, they had their property seized by the communists, who then allowed him to continue to work in his business, but instead of working for his own wealth, now everything that he produced went toward everybody else. And that's really what communism, socialism does. It makes you work for everybody else rather than for yourself. So they overnight became very poor, and as a result of living through that sort of thing, she went to school there in Russia. She ended up, however, migrating to the U.S. And so she came to the U.S. She became a citizen of the United States. She studied history and philosophy, and she began to write novels. She wrote We the Living and The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged is probably her best known work. But she, in these novels and in her actual work of philosophy, Rand undertakes to decry the kind of things that led to communism. And she does it in a very, very whimsical way, very winsome way. She's a very good author, and is able to translate her ideas into real life examples very well in her fiction novels. So anyway, they're very engaging, even if you don't like them, even if you don't agree with the theory, I guess. They're very engaging. Well, anyway, Rand herself says that she was born not an American, but she became an American by choice because America was the freest nation left in the world. It was the beacon of the world at the time, the one that was not descending into socialism. And she very much admired that. Because again, egoism is sort of undergirds capitalism. That's sort of the economic theory. Well, Rand saw this as a good thing, and that's why she sort of adopts America as her country of choice, or her homeland. Well, anyway, she goes on to write, and she writes about a number of things. She calls her philosophy objectivism, and in the process of objectivism, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but she develops an egoistic type of ethic that's implicit in her system. And what I want to give now is her argument for egoism. Now, another thing you want to know about Rand is that Rand is an atheist. She does not believe in the existence or the immortality of the soul or the existence of eternal life. She believes that this life is the only one that anyone will ever have. So kind of make the best of it that you can is her notion. But here's her argument for egoism. It starts off like this. It says that one's own life is a thing that is most valuable to them. So your life is the thing that's most valuable to you. My life is the thing that's most valuable to me. Our own life is the thing that has the highest value to us. Now, understand when she says life, I want you to understand what she means here, because she's not just talking about the fact that you are breathing as opposed to not breathing. That's not what she's talking about. When Rand says that your life is the thing of highest value, she's talking about not only the fact that you are breathing as opposed to not breathing, but also those things in life that make life worth living. Your dreams, your aspirations, why it is that you get out of bed every morning, the things that you value, your bank accounts, your education, your whatever it is that you value in your life. Those pursuits, maybe it's a form of art, maybe it's philosophy, maybe it's trying to help others, whatever the case may be, whatever it is that makes you value your life, that's the thing that's most valuable to you. And you ought to be able to pursue those things that are most valuable to you. So anyway, she believes, she starts out with the notion that one's own life is the thing that's most valuable to them. The next thing that she says is that reason is the human's only means of survival. Reason is a person's means of survival. Now, if you think about a human being and their ability to survive, let's face it, we're not the fastest thing. If we were to try to run away from a predator, we wouldn't get very far most times. We don't have big fangs, big teeth. We don't have claws. We don't have the ability to fly to get away from predators, or swim away real fast, or breathe underwater. The modifications of our body, the adaptations that we have. Let's face it, even the strongest human being alive, if they were put in an enclosure with a silverback gorilla, they're not going to last very long. The fastest man alive, if they're going to race a cheetah, not going to live very long. You get the drift, right? So human adaptations are not those things that lead to us being able to physically survive. Our means of survival, rather than being a physical adaptation, rather than being speed of foot, rather than being flight or strength, our adaptation is our mind. And because of this, mankind has become the apex predator on planet Earth. Because their adaptation involves their mind or their mental prowess, human beings, unlike any other animal, or better than any other animal, can survive in areas as hostile as outer space or under the sea. We are able to do that. No other animal is able to do that because they don't possess the rational faculty that we as humans do. Now, there are some animals that are smarter than others, for sure, without a doubt. But none of them possess the same kind of ability that human beings do. Because of our ability, we can walk unafraid in most places of the world. So we are at the top of the food chain, so to speak. Our reason is our adaptation for survival. It's our means for survival. That's how we live. As a human being, we have made clothes. We've used reason to make clothes. We've used reason to build shelters, to build an efficient and effective and safe way to heat those shelters and make sure that we stay within a livable range of temperatures. Because of our reason, we're able to survive. So reason is our adaptation for survival. So one's own life is the thing that is most high value to them. Reason is our adaptation or our means of survival. And then she goes on to say that altruism is immoral because it is irrational. It is immoral because it is irrational. So back to the first 2 points, let me explain this one by referring you back to the first two. If reason is our means of survival, then what that means is that reason is the means by which we protect or procure that which is most valuable to us. Right? Our life is that which is most valuable. Reason is the way that we protect our life. And so if there's anything that works against our survival, then by definition, that would be in violation of reason. That would be irrational, is what she's saying. Now, altruism is immoral because it's irrational. Now, why is altruism irrational? Altruism is irrational, says Rand, because altruism does not allow for you to assert your right to your own life. Altruism does not allow you to assert your right to your own life. It flies in the face of reason, therefore it's irrational. Now, what do you mean that altruism doesn't allow you to have a right to life? Well, I can explain this, I guess, by maybe giving an example from my own faith tradition. There was a woman who was a missionary by the name of Lottie Moon who lived many years ago, 2 centuries ago. And she lived and grew up, and she became a missionary to China. And she wanted to go, and so she did. She went over to China and she set up a mission. And part of her ministry there was that she had a food pantry, and she had this food pantry, and that's a place where people who did not have food to eat, they could come and they could get food, and then they would go. They could get either cheap or free or something like that. They could get a meal so that they don't starve to death. And she raised money to be able to do this, and it was going really well and fine and good. But over the course of time, though, China descended into that part of China, that region, descended into war. And back in that day, that when a warring faction would come into your place, they would not only fight the army, but they would also destroy the crops and steal the crops. They would take all the animals and slaughter them for food. And then before you know it, there's no food in the land to be had by anybody. And that's exactly what happened. That led to a famine. Well, in the case of a famine, food becomes more scarce. The people needing food become more plentiful. And so Lottie began giving away her food, giving away all the food in her pantry, and to the point where, in order to avoid seeing people starve to death, she would give away her own food as well. And we might look at that and think, oh, that's very altruistic. And it is. It's looking out for the concern of others. However, what ended up happening to her, she got so sick that she eventually died from complications of malnutrition. So it killed her. Being altruistic killed her. Now, one might say, well, that's great. She gave her life for someone else. And you know what? If somebody wants to do that, the egoist would say that's fine. They're allowed to do that. But altruism is an ethical stance that says you should look out at for the benefit of others, at the expense of yourself, even. In other words, you don't have a right to look out for yourself, because you have to look out for the benefit of others. You have to expend yourself for them. You have to give of your substance, of your time, of your energy, of your effort, so that they might be prospered, they might be benefited. And you don't have a right to those things that are yours, of your life. But that's what altruism would say. Well, if that's the case, if an altruist followed through on that consistently, well, they're going to starve to death, because there's always somebody in need. They're going to end up killing themselves or dying of starvation, because there's always someone in need. And so Rand points this out, and she says, see, altruism is incompatible with survival, because therefore it's irrational, because reason is that which helps us survive. And so altruism is immoral because it's irrational. Egoism, on the contrary, says Rand, is the highest ethic, because only egoism affirms one's own right to live. Only egoism affirms one's right to live. As an egoist, you can help others, but you can also have the right to keep your substance and that which you work for yourself. You can do either. Altruism, not so much. You have the responsibility of filling other people's bellies before you fill yours. So this is Rand's point. Because altruism does not allow you to pursue that which is most precious to you, namely your life, because it requires of you to give your substance, to give your effort, time, and energy so that others may be benefited at your own expense, it is immoral. It is irrational. It will lead to, it's almost like self-immolation or suicide. So that's what altruism will lead to, says Rand, if followed through consistently. Egoism is the only ethic that can be followed through consistently, she would say. Well, that's interesting. When I first studied egoism, I went into it with the notion of this is a terrible ethic. You know, and but as I hear it sort of spelled out, it causes you to kind of stop and think for a minute. Maybe it isn't what I thought it was at first, and maybe there's more to it than I originally thought. Maybe I still don't believe it. Don't believe that it's the highest ethic, but maybe there's more to it than I thought. And so that's egoism. A couple of things that you might think of, and just kind of as a thought experiment, some questions you might ask yourself is, how can an egoist then, if this is what egoism is, how can an egoist then genuinely say that they love someone? I mean, if an egoist is going to give a Valentine's Day card, what is it going to say? I love you for what you do for me? Something of that nature. You know, Rand believed that love is actually, whereas people think of love as being unconditional, love is sacrificing yourself for the other and all this stuff, that Rand says, oh, that's nothing. That's a bunch of hogwash. Actually, love, she says, is the most selfish emotion that we can have, or the most selfish relationship or orientation toward someone else that we can ever have. She says that, for example, she says, would your wife, for example, if you're a man, would your wife care, or would she consider herself loved if you acted toward every other woman the same way you acted toward her? No, she wants to keep you all for herself, right? She wants to have that exclusivity with you. That's typically the notion of love. And divorce courts are filled with people, filled with couples who are divorcing because somebody tried to love them like they love their spouse. You know, they tried to love somebody like they love their spouse. No, love is a very selfish emotion, a very selfish relationship, she would say. Could an egoist ever give their life for anything? That's another interesting question. If life is the thing that is most highest of value, could an egoist ever give their life or justify giving their life for anything or anyone? And Rand would say, yeah, egoists could give their life for someone. And even Rand, who did not believe, I mean, it's obvious to see if a person were a theist or a religious egoist, they might be giving their life so that they could earn awards in heaven, and that would be sort of a self-interest thing. But Rand, even the atheist Rand, would say, you know what? If a person valued something so much that to live without it would be not worth living, then they could give their life in pursuit of that thing. So, for example, if I valued liberty so much that I cannot bear living without it, then I might be able to justify, let's say, going to war or raising arms against a nation or a people who came in threatening my liberty. And I knew if they like took over, that I would not have liberty anymore. Then I might be able to justify, okay, going to war with them and losing my life, because I would not want to live life without that freedom or that liberty. So yeah, it's possible for an egoist to give their life for something. But egoism is an interesting philosophy. Well, don't forget to do the reading and do the quizzes, both for this video and also for the reading. And we will see you in the next video, where we will talk about utilitarianism. Thank you very much.